Brian had always been the curious type, an attribute that both served and troubled him in equal measure. When he moved into the old Victorian house on Maple Street, his friends were skeptical. The house had a history, one steeped in rumors of disappearances and mysterious occurrences. But Brian saw it as an opportunity, a chance to delve into the unknown. The first few weeks were uneventful. Brian spent his days unpacking and nights poring over the house's architectural details. It wasn't until he stumbled upon the basement door, hidden behind a stack of old, dusty boxes, that things began to take a darker turn. The door was locked, but a sense of unease crept over him as he realized it wasn't just any lock. It was a padlock, and a heavy one at that. Curiosity piqued, Brian decided to find the key. He searched the house methodically, combing through every drawer, every nook, and every cranny. Days turned into weeks, and his obsession with the basement grew. Finally, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the attic, he found it, a rusty old key that seemed to fit the lock perfectly. The moment the padlock clicked open, a shiver ran down Brian's spine. He hesitated, his hand on the doorknob, before finally pushing the door open. The basement was dark, the air thick with the smell of damp and mold. He fumbled for a light switch, his fingers brushing against cold stone walls until he found a string hanging from the ceiling. He pulled it, and a dim, flickering bolt cast eerie shadows across the room. The basement was larger than he expected, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, boxes labeled with dates going back decades, and an assortment of tools scattered across a workbench. As he explored, Brian felt a growing sense of unease. Something was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Then he saw it, an old wooden door at the far end of the basement, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. Unlike the rest of the basement, the door looked new, out of place. He approached it cautiously, noticing that it too had a lock. This time, however, the key he found didn't fit. Determined to uncover the basement's secrets, Brian decided to break the lock. He fetched a hammer from the workbench, and with a few forceful swings, the lock gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. In the center stood a single wooden chair, and on the floor, a large stain that looked suspiciously like blood. Brian's heart pounded as he stepped inside. The walls were lined with newspaper clippings, all detailing local disappearances over the years. His stomach churned as he realized the dates on the boxes matched the dates of the disappearances. Whoever had lived here before him had been keeping track. As he backed out of the room, something caught his eye, a small leather-bound notebook lying on the floor near the chair. He picked it up, flipping through the pages. The entries were erratic, filled with ramblings about voices, shadows, and a growing paranoia. The last entry was dated the day before Brian moved in. He heard a noise behind him, a faint whisper that sent chills down his spine. He spun around, but there was no one there. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Had someone been living in the basement? Were they still here? Brian decided to leave the basement and call the police. But as he turned to leave, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. He rushed to it, pulling on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped. His phone was upstairs, and there was no way to call for help. He pounded on the door, shouting, but the thick walls muffled his cries. As he sat in the dim light, his mind raced with possibilities. Who had locked him in, and why? The whispers grew louder, filling the room with an unsettling presence. Brian backed into the corner, clutching the notebook like a lifeline. The entries seemed to taunt him, their words blurring together as the shadows closed in. In the flickering light, Brian saw a figure standing at the far end of the room. It was just a shadow, but its presence was unmistakable. He tried to move, but his legs felt like lead. The figure took a step forward, and Brian's breath caught in his throat. He was no longer alone in the basement. Brian's heart pounded in his chest as the shadowy figure moved closer. He could see the outline more clearly now, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Brian's mind raced with terror, but he forced himself to focus, to think of a way out. "Who are you?" Brian's voice was barely more than a whisper, trembling with fear. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if considering his question. For a moment, the basement was silent, the only sound Brian's ragged breathing. Then the figure spoke, its voice a low, rasping whisper. "I am what remains," it said, "what remains of those who were forgotten." Brian's mind struggled to comprehend the words. He glanced around the room, eyes falling on the newspaper clippings, the disappearances, the stains on the floor. Everything pointed to a horrifying truth. This was a place of torment, a prison for lost souls. "You don't have to stay here," Brian said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I can help you. We can get out of here together." The figure seemed to hesitate, its form wavering in the dim light. Brian took a tentative step forward, extending a hand. But as he did, the shadows around the figure deepened, swirling like a dark vortex. "You cannot help," the figure whispered. "You cannot escape." Brian's hope dwindled, replaced by a growing sense of dread. He needed to find another way out. Desperation fueled his actions as he scanned the room, looking for anything that might aid his escape. His eyes landed on a small window near the ceiling, just large enough for him to squeeze through. With newfound determination, Brian moved quickly, grabbing a nearby chair and dragging it under the window. He climbed onto it, straining to reach the latch. His fingers fumbled in the darkness, but finally, he managed to pry the window open. The figure moved closer, the air growing colder with its approach. Brian could feel its presence, a palpable weight pressing down on him. He clambered through the window, scraping his arms on the rough edges, but he didn't care. Freedom was just inches away. As he pulled himself through, the figure reached out, its icy fingers grazing his ankle. Brian kicked frantically, breaking free and tumbling onto the grass outside. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not daring to look back. The night was eerily quiet as he sprinted across the yard and into the street. He didn't stop until he was safely inside his car, doors locked and engine running. His hand shook as he dialed the police, his voice frantic as he explained the situation. When the authorities arrived, they found Brian sitting in his car, pale and shaken. He led them to the basement, recounting everything he had seen and experienced. The officers searched the basement thoroughly but found no trace of the shadowy figure or any signs of recent activity. Brian's story was met with skepticism, but the evidence, the newspaper clippings, the bloodstains, the notebook, couldn't be ignored. The house was sealed off, pending further investigation. Days turned into weeks, and Brian tried to move on, but the memories haunted him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, watching, waiting. He moved to a new house, hoping for a fresh start, but the fear lingered, a constant shadow in the back of his mind. Late at night, when the world was quiet and the darkness seemed to close in, Brian would hear faint whispers, reminders of the basement and the figure that had once trapped him. He knew he would never truly escape the horrors he had uncovered, nor the chilling realization that some secrets are best left buried. And so Brian lived with the knowledge that the past is never truly gone, and that the shadows that lurk in the corners of forgotten places can never be fully outrun. Catherine shivered as she stood before the basement door. The old wooden frame looked out of place in her modern house, a relic from when the property was first built in the 1920s. She had always avoided the basement, preferring to keep it locked and out of sight. But today, curiosity, or perhaps necessity, had gotten the better of her. She needed to find the source of the strange noises she had been hearing for the past week. It started with soft, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to rise from the depths below. Catherine dismissed them at first, attributing them to the house settling or the wind playing tricks on her. But the whispers grew louder, evolving into faint, echoing voices that filled the silence of the night. She had to know what was down there. Taking a deep breath, she turned the old brass key in the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. She flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. Cursing under her breath, Catherine pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dusty steps and cobweb-covered walls. She descended slowly, each step creaking under her weight. The air grew colder and mustier with every step, and she could feel the chill seeping into her bones. When she reached the bottom, she swept the flashlight around, revealing a large, cluttered space. Old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and discarded tools filled the basement, casting eerie shadows in the dim light. Catherine moved cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. She stopped suddenly when she saw an old trunk in the corner, partially hidden under a tattered sheet. The whispers seemed to grow louder as she approached it. She knelt down, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside, she found a collection of old photographs, yellowed with age. They depicted a family she didn't recognize, parents and 2 children, smiling and happy. But as she flipped through the photos, a feeling of unease washed over her. The last few photos showed the family in the basement, their expressions turning from joy to terror. In the final photograph, the family was gathered around the very trunk she was looking in, their faces twisted in fear as they pointed towards something out of the frame. A sudden crash behind her made Catherine jump. She spun around, her flashlight beam dancing wildly across the basement. She saw nothing out of place, but the noise had come from the direction of an old door she had never noticed before. It was partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, its paint peeling and the wood rotting. With growing dread, she moved toward the door. She hesitated for a moment before reaching out and pulling it open. The door creaked loudly, revealing a narrow passageway that led deeper into the darkness. The whispers grew louder still, now unmistakably voices, murmuring incoherently. Catherine's curiosity battled with her fear. She knew she should turn back, lock the basement, and forget about the noises. But something compelled her to move forward. She squeezed through the narrow opening, the passageway closing in around her. The air grew colder and the voices became clearer, though she still couldn't make out what they were saying. The passageway ended at another door, this one made of metal and secured with a heavy padlock. Catherine's heart sank. She didn't have a key for this lock. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something glinting in the corner. It was an old rusty key. With trembling hands, she picked it up and inserted it into the padlock. To her surprise, it turned easily. The lock clicked open, and she pushed the door ajar. The voices surged, louder and more urgent, as if warning her to stay away. She stepped through the door and found herself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with dusty books and strange artifacts. In the center of the room was a table, and on it, a single book lay open. Catherine approached it, her eyes drawn to the faded, handwritten text. As she read the first few lines, the voices stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. Catherine's blood ran cold as she realized what the book described. It was a detailed account of the house's history and the terrible events that had taken place in the basement. The book told of a previous owner who had conducted dark rituals, summoning something from beyond. The whispers, the voices, they were the remnants of those who had been trapped in the house, their souls bound to the basement. Catherine slammed the book shut and turned to leave, but the door was no longer there. Panic set in as she searched for an exit, her flashlight flickering. The voices returned, louder and more menacing, their incoherent murmurs filling the room. She was trapped, just like the souls before her. Desperation drove her to the corner of the room, where she found a small, hidden panel in the wall. She pried it open, revealing a narrow tunnel. Without hesitation, she crawled through it, her heart pounding in her chest. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, but finally she saw a faint light ahead. She emerged in the basement, her clothes torn and her body bruised. She scrambled up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind her. Catherine locked it and collapsed on the floor, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't stay in the house any longer. As she packed her belongings, the whispers continued, a constant reminder of what lay beneath. Catherine left the house that night, vowing never to return. But as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, the voices following her into the darkness. Catherine drove aimlessly for hours, her mind replaying that harrowing experience in the basement. The whispers still echoed in her ears, and every shadow seemed to harbor a lurking presence. She finally pulled into a motel, desperate for rest. The room was small and sparse, but it provided a sense of security she hadn't felt in days. She collapsed onto the bed, but sleep eluded her. The events in the basement haunted her thoughts, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. As dawn approached, she resolved to uncover more about the house's dark history. She couldn't live in fear forever. The local library opened at 9, and Catherine was there as soon as the doors unlocked. She requested all available records on her house and spent hours poring over old newspapers and archives. The house had a storied past, with multiple owners meeting untimely and mysterious ends. The previous owner, a man named Harold Sutton, was particularly notorious. Sutton had been a recluse, rarely seen by neighbors. Rumors swirled about his strange practices and odd visitors at odd hours of the night. One article caught her eye. It detailed a police investigation into the disappearance of Sutton's wife and children. The case was never solved, and Sutton himself vanished shortly thereafter. Catherine's fingers trembled as she read a final entry, a journal written by a local historian who had taken an interest in the house. He documented a series of strange occurrences and a growing sense of dread that culminated in his decision to abandon the project. His last entry mentioned finding an old book in the basement and hearing voices urging him to leave. With a sinking feeling, Catherine realized the book she had found was the same one mentioned in the journal. The historian's warning echoed in her mind. The voices will never let you go. Determined to break free from the house's grip, she sought out a local historian who might provide more insight. Dr. Evelyn Harper was a small, elderly woman with a sharp mind. She listened intently as Catherine recounted her experiences, her expression growing more concerned with each passing detail. "You did the right thing by leaving," Dr. Harper said, "but the connection you've made with the house might not be so easily severed." Catherine's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "The rituals conducted in that basement were meant to bind souls to the house," Dr. Harper explained. "By entering that room and reading the book, you forged a connection. The voices you hear are those trapped souls, trying to communicate their torment." "How do I break the connection?" Catherine asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Dr. Harper sighed. "It's not easy. The first step is to return the book to its place in the basement. Only then can we attempt to cleanse the house and free the souls trapped within." Catherine's blood ran cold at the thought of returning to the basement, but she knew it was the only way to end the nightmare. Armed with Dr. Harper's guidance, she drove back to the house that evening, the historian accompanying her. The house loomed ominously as they approached, its dark windows like hollow eyes watching their every move. Catherine unlocked the door, her hands trembling, and led Dr. Harper to the basement. The descent felt even more foreboding than before. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as they reached the bottom. The metal door stood ajar, the book still lying on the table. Catherine picked it up, the voices reaching a fever pitch as she did. "Place it on the shelf," Dr. Harper instructed, her voice steady, "and step back." Catherine did as she was told, her heart pounding in her chest. Dr. Harper began chanting softly, a mixture of Latin and ancient incantations. The air grew thick with tension, and the room seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. As the chanting reached its climax, the whispers turned into anguished cries. The walls shook, and Catherine felt a cold hand brush against her arm. She bit back a scream, watching as the book seemed to absorb the energy in the room. With a final resounding crash, the voices ceased, and an eerie silence filled the air. Dr. Harper lowered her hands, her face pale but determined. "It's done. The connection is broken." Catherine let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Is it over?" Dr. Harper nodded. "The souls are free, and the house hold on you is broken, but you must never return here." Catherine didn't need to be told twice. She left the house without looking back, the weight of the ordeal lifting from her shoulders. As she drove away, the sun began to rise, casting a warm glow over the landscape. For the first time in weeks, Catherine felt a sense of peace. She knew the memories of the basement would haunt her for some time, but she was free. The whispers were gone, and with them, the darkness that had plagued her life. She was determined to move forward, leaving the past and the horrors of the basement behind.